Hello everyone, I hope you are all doing well. I wanted to touch base and introduce the next week for our module on gifted education being a right or a privilege. So I was really impressed by the way that you guys handled this discussion board. As I mentioned last week, I think it's a challenging one, and I was able to see that many of you had the same experience of wanting to say, of course, gifted education is a right, but then struggling to find the proof of that in your learning materials. So I did interact with most of you guys on your posts and try to challenge by providing some additional questions or feedback. But you did a really good job kind of unpacking this issue and starting to get to the heart of some of the challenges that we have in gifted education. I just want to walk through a couple of things that I want to point out concerning this topic. The first one that we need to be very clear on is there is no federal funding for gifted education. This is primarily or solely a state responsibility that often will trickle down even into districts. And as you have seen from your materials last week, not all states have any kind of law that is based on gifted education. So there is no federal law that says that we have to serve gifted children, which is alarming. Another thing I do want to point out, and I'm not sure how closely you guys follow education news, but there's a lot going on in terms of gifted education in the news as well. One of the only, actually the only federal grant that is targeted toward gifted learners is called the Javits Grant with a J, so Javitts. The Javits Grant is really unique because it funds research and outreach that is based on underrepresentation in gifted education. So something that we'll study later this semester are the pervasive issues of underrepresentation in gifted ed. We have a lot of overrepresentation of affluent white students and a lot of underrepresentation of more diverse populations, particularly African American students and Latin American students as well. So that is something we cannot ignore, and the Javits Grant is such an important component of advocating for gifted students from all populations. And recent news has shown that we're actually going to lose funding for that grant, which is a big deal because we need federal funding, and also the Javits Grant has been very helpful for advocating for gifted students. So I would encourage you guys to stay on top of the news. I'll try to send you any updates that I've seen, but if you go on to NAGC's website, which is the National Association for Gifted Children, you will see they have already published a white paper about this and are being very upfront about some changes that are occurring. So very, very little funding goes to gifted education. Again, this Javits Grant is the only form of federal funding for research in gifted education, and as it stands now, we will lose that funding. So this is something that is not okay, and as future teachers and current teachers, I really encourage you to stay on top of the news, and particularly for gifted education, always keep an eye on the National Association for Gifted Children. So again, we have no federal funding for gifted education. This is primarily a state responsibility, and because of that, every state looks different. A lot of you guys mentioned that not all states have laws that are necessitating gifted education, and that is totally true. So while most teachers, I would hazard to say all teachers would argue, of course, all of our students have the right to learn and all of our students deserve these gifted programs, we have to approach the truth that our laws are not keeping us accountable for that. Another thing many of you mentioned is that we have such a large inclusive definition of giftedness that it is difficult to then hold responsible for serving all gifted children. So this is a common theme that we see where we define giftedness in terms of academic achievement and leadership ability and creativity. and artistic ability, but then we don't see that aligned to the services that we provide. So I was impressed that many of you guys mentioned one of the issues with accountability is that we have such a huge definition, which actually makes accountability more difficult. Many of you mentioned that serving the gifted is a shared responsibility, which is totally true. We have the schools, we have the districts, the teachers, the administrators, and oftentimes even the parents. So I want to challenge this for a minute to think through all of those moving pieces. Yes, it's a shared responsibility. With that shared responsibility comes a lot of difficult issues in terms of accountability. So let's walk through these one at a time. First off, the teachers. So yes, we as teachers do have a lot of responsibility. However, we do want to counter that by the fact that very few teachers are trained in gifted education. So what happens is teachers who have not been trained are likely to just operate under their assumptions of what it means to be gifted. So that's definitely dangerous. Many of you mentioned that lack of training. A lot of you have been mentioning the importance of gifted services, but in a manner that makes it seem that those gifted services are outside of the regular classroom. For example, many of you mentioned after Adam and the case study with the turkey that he drew, oh, we should test Adam for gifted services, which is great. Again, Adam was just in kindergarten, so typically we would be testing in the way of observation, like that case study was. But it's not a matter of, oh, let's test you for gifted, and then you receive this separate gifted education. The majority of gifted education actually occurs in the regular education classroom through differentiated services. So that is one of the main components of gifted services is differentiation within the traditional classroom. And I think it's important for us to say that because every single teacher will interact with gifted students at some point in their day. And it's important that we don't just consider gifted services within like a pull-out model or this is your gifted time. Gifted children are gifted all of the time. So it's important that we as teachers are recognizing that it would not be just the gifted teacher who is responsible. Another thing that you mentioned, several of you did, was parents. And in this case, with our case study, the parents of these children were huge advocates. And that is not something that we can rely on as educators. Every single one of our students has parents or caretakers that have had diverse experiences and interactions with education. A lot of students may have parents who were hurt by the education system. They were told they could not succeed. The schools did not fully serve them. This happens a lot with students from underrepresented populations. There's not a lot of systemic belief that certain children can succeed, which is beyond wrong. But it's important to realize that some parents, more than you may think, don't trust school. So they may not come to your parent-teacher conference, mainly because they could be working or doing something else for the family, but also because they struggle to trust our schools. Given today's climate and sense of immigration, this is a whole other thing. Parents may be fearful to be super interactive in a school environment, or they may not understand what gifted education is. Imagine being an African American student and you look at your gifted classroom, which these days is typically full of white students, which is okay, that's not wrong, but it is wrong in the sense that we're not representing all of our students because all students can be gifted. There are a lot of parents that I've worked with who have told me, listen, I don't want my kid in these services. He won't be provided services in the way that is effective to him. There will be a lot of social kind of negative things that could come from this, and I don't want him in these services. So it's important that we recognize that all parents will have kind of a diverse experience with schools. So the main takeaway from this case study is we have got to advocate for gifted children, and that starts with spreading awareness of what it actually means to be gifted. Not these stereotypical views of, oh, gifted kids are always in the front of the classroom and they're perfectly behaved and they're geniuses. I've said from the start that gifted children, they're just different. They think differently. They interact with the world differently. And because of this, they truly need gifted services. So I think you guys did an excellent job really unpacking some of the hard truths in this case study. And I was happy to see that you were quoting a lot of your library resources. So great job on that. This week's assignment is definitely different. So last week I was having you kind of critically analyze what are these different sources telling me and come to the fact that gifted education is not necessarily a right for all students. It's definitely important that you understand that. But then this week, I want you to shift your focus. And this week, we are advocating for these gifted students. So your assignment for this week is to create a gifted education flyer. I usually describe this as, imagine you are in the teacher workroom and you're putting a flyer into every teacher's mailbox that describes the most important information about gifted students. This is not a paper. This is not a full PowerPoint presentation. This is something we would put in our colleagues' mailbox and say, I hope they read this because this flyer contains the most important information. I truly believe in gifted education. We have to start solving problems by raising awareness of what giftedness really means. And that can happen both from a top down, so yes, through policy, and yes, that's something I'm very passionate about, but also from a bottom up, as in you are future teachers or current teachers, and you can spread the word to other teachers who spread the word to their principals, to other principals, and all of a sudden that can trickle up. So I do think this needs to happen from both directions if we really want change in gifted education. So in order to complete this assignment, you are creating a flyer for gifted education. If you look on Blackboard, you will see that there are a couple of things I want you to definitely address within this flyer. So the first, who are the gifted? You can definitely quote one of the definitions that we have studied, maybe even more than one, but make your definition very clear and make sure that it's not just going along with some assumptions that we may have about gifted children. So first off, who are the gifted? Secondly, what are some common myths about the gifted? I'd encourage you to go back to that first myths versus realities survey that we took. Third, do gifted students really require differentiation? This is something I get a lot of questions on when I'm in the field consulting. Well, do they really need extra services? Do they really need help? They're fine on their own, right? That's false, and you need to show through this flyer that they do require gifted services. And lastly, how can various individuals support the gifted? So the key here is, what is your takeaway for teachers? What is your takeaway for students? What is your takeaway for parents, for administrators? Because this is a shared responsibility, we also need to make sure that we are providing avenues for all of these stakeholders to really make a change. So last week we studied some hard truth that gifted education, as much as we want it to be a law, that we want there to be a lot of accountability, there simply is not. And now this week, I want you to shift toward advocating for the needs of gifted services. So in creating this flyer, I want you to think about how can you best present this information to share what you know about gifted children and to share what you know about how important these gifted services are. So again, within that flyer, you need to discuss who are the gifted, What are common myths about the gifted? Do these gifted students really need differentiated services? And finally, how can various individuals support the gifted? As always, there's a detailed rubric about the requirements for this assignment, and I'll be looking for your responses by Sunday evening. I would highly encourage you to think of this in a practical manner. Some of you, if not all of you, are out in the field already. Print these off and bring them to your school and put them in your teachers' mailboxes. I really encourage you to take that active step toward actually implementing some of these projects. And that's why I try to design them in a way that will support you as you begin to advocate for gifted children. As always, I am here to help. Please feel free to send me an email or set up a time to meet in person. And I hope that you all have a wonderful day.